Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Morphy Auction Company taking a look at a selection of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming April of 2019 premiere auction. Specifically, what we're looking at today are the original Ingram submachine guns made in Powder Springs, Georgia, the first of what is colloquially called the M10. And I should in fact just start out by pointing out that M10 is kind of a misnomer. What this actually is, these actually are Ingram M10 and M11 submachine guns, ultimately produced by MAC, the Military Armaments Corporation. So, to go to the beginning of our story, Gordon Ingram is an ex-World War II serviceman who is interested in firearms design, and right after World War II, he starts designing machine guns. The first one, he goes through a couple models. He actually starts with his M5 submachine gun. He was hoping to get a military contract, and so he figured the Army currently had the M3 submachine gun. He would leave the M4 as a, maybe they'll adopt an M4 at some point before my gun's ready, so we'll leave that out, and I'll call mine the M5. Well, his M5 was just a prototype, never went anywhere. He improved it with his M6. That gun actually did see reasonable, it actually saw substantial serial production, and in fact I have a whole video on the Ingram M6 if you're interested. You can check that out. There were then a couple subsequent prototypes developed in an attempt to improve on the M6, so the M7, M8, and M9 were all experimental guns. And all of those guns are kind of in the form of a Thompson submachine gun. It was with the M10 in 1964, 1965 that Ingram changed completely, and he went to this sort of stamped sheet metal, very boxy, telescoping bolt type of design. Now, his original M10 was in 9mm parabellum, and he was unable to find anyone interested in the thing, and it was just kind of dying on the vine for a couple of years. Until 1969, when he was introduced to a guy named Mitch WerBell III. Mitch WerBell had been in the OSS during World War II and either was or fancied himself, I think was, sort of a covert ops type of guy. And after the war, into the 1960s, he decided he wanted to manufacture covert ops type stuff for the military. And in particular, he focused on suppressors. He started a company called Sionics to manufacture suppressors. And he did, in fact, go on to make a lot of suppressors for the US military for a variety of guns. Suppressors for the M14, the M16. And when he met Ingram in 1969, he was basically on his way to Vietnam to demonstrate some of his suppressors, 45 caliber suppressors. And Ingram at the time had made an experimental version of his M10 in 45 ACP. And a mutual friend, actually Tom Nelson, who is a well-known and very well-regarded firearms author today, introduced the two of them, thinking, you know what, Ingram's 45 caliber submachine gun and 45 caliber suppressor could make a really interesting pair. And turns out they did. So they made a quick deal. Ingram loaned his gun to WerBell, who took it to Vietnam and started demonstrating it for special ops guys and army guys, and everyone over there really liked this thing. This was a very compact package submachine gun, and it was a big part of this gun is the combination of the gun with the suppressor. The suppressor gives you a place to actually hold on to the gun, which this thing has a very short muzzle. Not having a suppressor out here gives you a substantial likelihood of accidentally shooting your fingers off with it. And WerBell envisioned this as a special forces covert ops type of thing. It was naturally subsonic, chambered for 45 ACP. You've got this nice big suppressor on it. It makes for a pretty quiet, high rate of fire. You can lay down a lot of firepower at very close range very quickly with the Ingram M10. So he took this to Vietnam to demo it to people. Turned out to be very popular. So he sends back word that, hey, get Ingram and let's start arranging to get the rights to manufacture this gun for him. And in fact, by 1970, he had convinced Ingram to join his company as chief of design or chief engineer. And in December of 1970, just shortly thereafter, they actually changed the name of the company. They created Military Armaments Corporation because, honestly, that's a better marketing name to work with than trying to sell submachine guns under a name like Sionics. So MAC was born. Now, they started off with a 45 caliber gun. Ingram had made his M10 in 9mm, But the 9mm is generally a supersonic cartridge, which means it's going to make a lot of noise whether it's got a suppressor on it or not. Mac would make a 9mm version of the M10, but they didn't actually put it into production until after they had had the chance to work with some reloading guys in the Georgia area and come up with a good, reliable subsonic 9mm loading that they could pair with the submachine gun. Because really, I think it's important to recognize that the whole purpose of this gun was really a package of gun and suppressor. All of these guns are made with threaded barrels directly for suppressors, and this was not really a common thing. This had been sort of a specialty idea before, and Ingram and WerBell wanted to create a ready-to-go package that was kind of a new sort of idea. At any rate, they also wanted a smaller version of the gun. Remember, WerBell was sort of a covert ops type of guy, and so they picked a smaller cartridge that was also natively subsonic, namely 380 automatic. And so they came up with a scaled-down version of the gun, the M11 submachine gun, chambered for 380, but basically the exact same package, just shrunk down. So same design, same mechanical functionality, same stock, and the same type of suppressor. So let's go ahead and take a look at what all three of these actually are. The original, the one and only Ingram, well, the one of very, very many, Ingram M10 submachine gun. This is a relatively small gun. As you can see, it really kind of fits the form factor of an oversized pistol, but it's a wide gun and it's a very dense gun. These things are heavy, substantially heavier than I think you would expect if you've never actually picked one up. This comes in at like 8 3/4 pounds. So this is basically the weight of a rifle, all compressed down into the size of this bulky block of a gun. Our markings on here are Ingram M10 caliber 45 auto. A couple relevant things to point out. When Ingram and WerBell were forced out of the company, all subsequent production, well, at least once they used up some of the already marked receiver flats, the owners of the company got rid of Ingram and they added Mac instead of Ingram. And that's where Mac 10 comes from. They were pissed at Ingram, they were unhappy with him and WerBell, and they wanted to take his name off the gun. So Military Armaments Corp is of course down here because that was the company name the whole time. Powder Springs, Georgia was the location of Mitch WerBell's basically, I think, a 30 or 40 acre farm where production began. It wasn't that long after production began that they moved to a larger facility elsewhere in Georgia, Marietta, Georgia, I believe. But they had actually a substantial number of receivers that had already been marked Powder Springs. So they were using Powder Springs marked receivers after they moved. There is the Military Armaments Corporation logo here, which is a Cobra wrapped around the world. And the Cobra is a very 80s thing. It is a combination of Cobra and Manta Ray. We have a serial number out here on the front of the gun, and there's a bit of information you can decode from this. These 6 digits are the actual serial number. The first 2 digits here are some data. The first digit tells you caliber. 1 is 45, 2 is 9mm, and 3 is 380. And the second digit tells you the year that it was produced, in the 1970s. So a 1 is 71. This is a 1973 production gun. There is a manual safety on this thing. So you have safe and fire right there. And then these were actually selective fire guns. So on the left side in the front, you have a selector switch offering you full auto or semi-auto. They are, however, open bolt guns in semi or full. So that's your firing position. When you pull the trigger, the whole thing drops, and it will continue to cycle in full auto until you release the trigger. The magazine, the original M10s were designed around a slightly modified M3 grease gun magazine. The lower ridge here has to be cut down by like 1/16 of an inch. They wanted to make sure people had to buy mags from them, at least, you know, organizational contracts had to get mags from them. It gives you a little nice extra profit margin there. So 30 rounds of 45 ACP. We have a pretty awful butt stock on here. It's virtually useless, although, to be fair, it is better than nothing at all. In order to deploy this, you have to squeeze it together and rotate it backwards, and there are locking pins right here. So in the deployed position, it locks in like that, or mostly locks in because it does wobble. And then you push the button on the bottom of the receiver, and you can extend the stock all the way out like that. You'll notice that the butt plate here is angled. That does a great job of sliding off your shoulder. It's too short for most people. It's too low for most people. It's really kind of a terrible stock. But it does fold up very, very compactly, and it gets out of your way if you're not using it. And that's, I guess, something. There is a bracket here hanging around the muzzle that is for a nylon strap that gives you something to hold on to here, so you can kind of pull it back and not run the risk of getting your fingers out in front of the muzzle. And then one of the distinctive and very important features of these guns is this coarse threading on the barrel. That was on every one of them, and that was there specifically for the suppressors that were intended to be packaged with the guns. This is our original Military Armaments Corporation suppressor. So this is a 45 caliber suppressor, and we have the same sort of information down here. One indicates 45, it's 1972 production, and this is serial number 1148 there. And this is a cleanable, serviceable suppressor. So it's two-stage. You've got an expansion chamber back here, and then this end of the thing is a whole series of baffles and, well, stacked baffles like so. I'm not going to pull them all out. There's a big old stack of them in there. Now, that threading sits there, and this just screws on. There's no fancy locking collar. There's really no fancy anything. It just threads on there. Now you've got a suppressed Mac. There were some rubber covers. You'll see people covering these with cloth or wraps of various sorts, because with extended shooting, this will get very hot. However, with limited bits of shooting, certainly the first bit that you ever shoot, with, at a given range trip, you hold onto this thing by the suppressor, and that is your front grip. This really is a safety device for the Mac beyond just your hearing, because this prevents you from putting a hand in the way of the muzzle. This thing fires at about 1,000 rounds a minute, and without a good way to hold on to the front of the gun, it can be nigh uncontrollable. Certainly very challenging, especially for novice machine gun shooters. So the suppressor is really a good thing. It is an integral part of the Ingram submachine gun package. Now, the next version we're going to look at is also an M10. However, it is chambered for 9mm para, or PAR, I suppose. They abbreviated that a bit short. Note that our serial number here starts with a digit 2 for 9mm, and then it's a 1973 production gun. This is identical to the 45 caliber M10 with the exception of the grip frame, which is just a part that's welded onto the lower receiver. And this grip frame, of course, is set up to use 9mm magazines. Where they used grease gun mags on these, and in fact, Ingram's very first prototype 9mm M10 used a Sten gun magazine. However, he was concerned about unreliability of the Sten gun magazine, and so they changed to the sort of trapezoidal style of basically Walther MPK MPL magazines. So the 9mm version here uses a double stack, double feed magazine, where the 45 caliber version has just a single feed M3 grease gun type mag. I apologize, I actually don't have one of the magazines here to show you for this, but it looks just like a Walther MPK or MPL magazine. I should point out, all three of these are up for auction here at Morphy's. None of them come with magazines. The mags that are in the other two guns I have scrounged from other lots to be able to show you here. So the M10 9mm is a little bit lighter in weight than the 45, but not much. This is more like 7 2/3 pounds. The bolt's a little bit lighter, which accounts for most of that, the bolt and the barrel. Still a very chunky, very heavy gun. This is not all that covert and concealable. Before we go farther, actually, I should point out this real quick. This is the exact same design of suppressor made by Mac, and this is a 1972 suppressor. First digit 2 tells us it's in 9mm, and same design, just a different bore diameter to fit the 9mm guns. And that brings us to the baby Mac. This is the M11. The whole thing scaled down for a truly concealable covert package in 380 auto, but otherwise retaining all of the same features of the original M10. So this is designed to be sold as a package with a suppressor. It's got the exact same type of barrel threading to attach that suppressor. There we go. This is also a two-stage suppressor with cleanable baffles. It just doesn't have the different diameters to it because it's smaller for 380. There we have the markings on that one, caliber 380, and you'll notice right there, digit 3 for 380, and this one is a 1974 production, so actually relatively late production 380 suppressor. This guy is truly tiny. It does use a 32-round magazine of Military Armament Corporation's own design, because there weren't any good 380 magazines that would do. This is a single feed magazine, so the 9mm guns were the only ones to use double feed magazines. The stock design is exactly the same, just scaled down. There we go. Squeeze that, fold it up, and this gives you a true little bullet hose of a machine pistol. This thing, while the bigger Macs fire at about 1,000 rounds a minute, this is more like 1,500 or even 1,600 rounds a minute, depending on the ammunition. It will empty a magazine in about a second or less. It is an extremely high rate of fire gun. Again, much more usable with that suppressor on the front to hold on to, but ultimately of kind of limited utility in any situation. As one general is quoted as saying, it's ideal for a gunfight in a phone booth, and maybe not a whole lot else. This weighs in at about 3.5 pounds. It's interesting to note that it is marked caliber 9mm auto, as opposed to caliber 9mm PAR, para, because especially in Europe, this is 9mm short, 9x17mm. Still kind of an odd choice, but that's what they went with. It is easy to guarantee that this is not meant for 9mm parabellum, because the magazine well is in fact not big enough to fit 9mm parabellum ammunition in it with a magazine. In every other way, though, this is the same as the original larger scale M10s. So we can take this apart really easily. With these original powder springs Ingram guns, there is a spring-loaded latch right here at the front. If I pull that back, I can then push out this pin. All right, there we go. With that pin out, the upper lifts right off of the lower. There is our stripped lower. There's nothing else that needs to come apart in here. The fire control group looks a bit complicated because it does have this semi-auto selector built into it. So it's on fire position. So when I pull the trigger, the sear drops, that lets the bolt go forward, and it's just going to cycle until it either runs out of ammo or you release the trigger. In semi-auto, it goes down, but then you have a disconnector right here that is going to trip when the bolt goes forward and lift that sear back up, thus forcing you to pull the trigger a second time to fire it again. Moving on to the upper assembly, we pull the bolt back to here, and then we can pull the charging handle out. There is a little spring-loaded detent down inside there that holds this in. One of those kind of nicer elements to the original Ingram powder springs guns that you don't see in the later copies and knockoffs. So that comes out. Then the bolt assembly with its captive recoil spring comes out. We have our stamped and bent and welded upper assembly here. Got your little spring-loaded retention lever. The barrel, you'll notice, only sticks out this far, but because this uses a telescoping style of bolt, like an Uzi or one of the Czech 24, 25, 26, 23 submachine guns, the barrel is actually substantially longer than it looks. Just your firing pin is all the way back here, and the whole gun is kept short by moving the mass of the bolt up in front. On the bolt, we have a fixed firing pin. It is an open bolt firing gun. You'll notice there is a recoil spring here, and then there's also the second rod. That second rod is the ejector. So when the bolt compresses back, that rod comes out through the bolt face, and that's what kicks a cartridge out of the gun. We have an extractor down at the bottom to help control cartridges as they're being cycled out. And then there is the tiniest of little plastic buffers back here. One of the things to look for on these guns, this one, if this was rubber originally, it's turned to hard rubber. Some of these are made out of like a fiber sort of material. Some of them are some sort of soft synthetic material, and over time, these will completely disintegrate. So it's not uncommon, even if a gun is like brand new and unfired, it's not uncommon to open it up and find that the buffer has just disintegrated over time. So that's it. that's the entire field-stripped Ingram M11, and the M10 is exactly the same thing, just a little bit larger. Now, a couple things happened to the Military Armaments Corporation during just the few years while they were actually in existence. First off, they thought this gun was going to be tremendously successful, and they thought they had a really good shot at a big military contract. Maybe one with the United States, maybe with some other countries. They thought this gun really had serious military potential. And so they wanted to tool up to make quite a lot of guns, and that requires a lot of capital. So they went out looking for investment capital, and they found it in a group of investors who joined up under a business called Quantum. Well, at some point, this may have been aided by the fact that someone started to get the idea that the US military was seriously considering replacing the 1911 with the Ingram M10, which is a ludicrous idea that never happened and never would have happened, but it might have been helpful in lubricating some finance for the company. Well, when the US didn't place a large order for these guns, they did buy them in small numbers. A variety of different military operational branches bought them. The SEALs actually bought some. In fact, the SEALs bought them when the SEAL team and the UDT, the underwater demolition teams, were separate groups, and they each bought some of them. I think the Air Force ended up with some, and they made a number of small sales to a number of various small foreign countries, but nothing significant. And so that starts to kind of put a hurt on the company financially. You know, they've got a lot of money invested in this. They have to make some sales to get it back. And that created some friction within the company. In fact, a lot of friction within the company. And by the end of 1972, both Ingram and WerBell had actually been forced out of the company, and it was being run entirely by this investment group. Without a big military contract to fall back on, they had kind of limited options. These were legal to sell to the civilian market in the United States, because of course this is before 1986, they're made in the US, so these can be registered as transferable guns. They are, in fact, registered as transferable guns, and they can be sold to anyone with a $200 NFA tax stamp. And in the mid-1970s, $200 is a substantial amount of money, especially for what is supposed to be a very inexpensive submachine gun. And they didn't make all that many sales. There aren't that many people who were excited to go out and spend that kind of money on this kind of gun. Now, they did get some, and it was certainly aided by some clever marketing. In 1974, the movie McHugh, starring John Wayne and co-starring an Ingram M10 came out. That was certainly good publicity and helped with some sales, but not enough to keep this company going. In 1974 as well, the State Department decided to institute a new policy of prohibiting export of submachine guns with suppressors, or of submachine guns that could be readily fitted with suppressors. And that hit Military Armaments Corporation square in the jaw. That was a big problem for them. And by 1975, they were looking at basically bankruptcy. They started missing loan payments. The company went under. In April of 1976, there was a bankruptcy sale that sold off all the company's assets to try and pay off its debts. And that was the end of Military Armaments Corporation. So it only existed from 1970, very end of 1970, until the spring of 1976, just a few years. Now, they had a lot of guns in stock, and they had a lot of parts and a lot of tooling that were all distributed and sold in this auction. And a variety of different companies bought up both guns and tooling and parts, and would continue to produce this style of Ingram submachine gun for many years after the fact. Those companies would include RPB, SWD, Cobra, Leatherwood, a number of other smaller companies making smaller numbers of guns. But there's a large variety, and a kind of confusing variety, of guns under all of those names that came after the Military Armaments Corporation that was the true namesake of this gun. So we're not going to talk about those in this video. This has gone long enough already. We'll cover some of those varieties in a later video. I thought it would be really cool to take a look at the three here that are the true original MAC-10 submachine guns. These are generally seen to be they are the best manufactured of all of the Ingram type guns. And it's really fairly, there aren't a whole lot of them out there. And contrary to what a lot of people might expect, these have actually become somewhat collectible guns. They're desirable and they are sought after. So having all three models with all three of their matching types of suppressors is a pretty cool thing. So If you're interested in any one of them, all three of these are coming up for sale here at Morphy's. They are all registered, fully transferable NFA machine guns, so they're all subject to background check and tax stamp as is standard for NFA guns. If you look at the description text below, you'll find a link to ForgottenWeapons.com, and from there you can click over to the catalog pages for each of these three, and check out Morphy's pictures, description, price estimates, all that sort of stuff. Place bids for them online if you're so inclined, or just flip through catalog and window shop. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.